They said Clara Whitmore had 3 days left before the bank took her ranch, but what nobody in Dry Creek expected was that a silent cowboy would ride in and change the story of that land forever. The morning the notice arrived, the wind carried a thin veil of dust across the pasture, and Clara Whitmore stood at the gate of her ranch watching it move like pale smoke over the dry grass. The same 40 acres her father had cleared with a borrowed mule and a shovel nearly 20 years earlier. The paper nailed to her fence fluttered in the breeze, a crisp white notice stamped with the seal of Sutton Agricultural Bank, giving her exactly 72 hours to pay a debt the town already believed she could never repay. Folks passing along the road slowed their wagons just enough to read it, then drove on without a word. In a small frontier town, people didn't need to say things out loud for everyone to understand them. Dry Creek had already decided Clara Whitmore was finished. By noon the rumor had drifted through the saloon, the general store, and the blacksmith's porch, carried on low voices and knowing glances. Harold Sutton, the banker who owned half the mortgages in 3 counties, was finally going to claim the Whitmore land, a stretch of rolling pasture that caught more rain than anywhere else in the valley. Men leaning over poker tables spoke about it like the outcome had already happened, measuring the property in cattle and water rights instead of memories. Only Clara refused to see it that way. She moved through the ranch that afternoon like someone determined to hold a line against the horizon itself, checking fences, counting the remaining cattle, and brushing dust from the weathered wooden sign that still read Whitmore Ranch in her father's steady hand. The place felt quieter than usual, as if the prairie itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Toward evening the road into town shimmered in the fading heat, and that was when a lone rider appeared on the ridge, moving slow, horse and man both carrying the tired look of a long trail behind them. Nobody in Dry Creek noticed him at first. The town had seen plenty of riders come and go, drifters chasing work or a place to sleep. But there was something about the way this one moved through the streets just before sundown, calm and unhurried, that made the sheriff glance up from his chair and follow him with quiet eyes. The stranger tied his horse outside the saloon, brushed a layer of red dust from his coat, and stepped inside without asking for attention. He ordered coffee instead of whiskey, sat where he could see the street through the window, and said almost nothing at all. Outside, the sky darkened into a deep prairie blue, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass across the town. Somewhere out beyond the last row of buildings, Clara Whitmore stood alone at the gate of the ranch she might lose in 3 days, while a man no one recognized watched the road in silence, as if he had arrived in Dry Creek for a reason the town had not yet begun to understand. The next morning the town of Dry Creek woke the way small frontier towns always did, slow and dusty, with the smell of coffee drifting out of the saloon and wagon wheels creaking along the main road. But beneath that ordinary rhythm there was a quiet tension moving through the streets like wind before a storm. Everyone knew about the notice nailed to Clara Whitmore's fence, and in a place where news traveled faster than horses, the story had already grown larger than the truth. Men leaning against the railing outside the general store spoke in low voices about how long the Whitmore family had held that ranch, while others quietly calculated how many cattle the land could support once the bank owned it. Harold Sutton's name passed from mouth to mouth with a certain careful respect, because in a town like Dry Creek the man who held the mortgages often held the future as well. Out on the edge of town Clara had been awake since before sunrise. She moved through the barn with steady hands, filling buckets, brushing dust from saddle leather, counting every animal the way her father had taught her when she was still small enough to ride on the fence rails. The cattle moved slowly through the morning light, their hooves pressing shallow marks into the dry earth, and for a moment the ranch almost felt the way it used to, before numbers written on bank paper began deciding the fate of good land. Clara paused near the corral gate and looked out across the pasture where the grass rolled toward the distant hills like waves on a quiet ocean. It was hard to imagine that a place so wide could be lost over a few lines of ink and a clock ticking down 72 hours. Back in town, the stranger from the night before still sat in the same corner of the saloon where he had finished his coffee long after the lamps were lit. Morning sunlight slipped through the dusty window and settled across the brim of his hat, but he did not seem in any hurry to move. Sheriff Walter Briggs noticed him again while stepping in from the street. the same way a man notices something out of place without fully understanding why. Riders came through Dry Creek every week, but most of them spoke loudly, asked questions, or searched for work. This one did none of those things. He watched the street the way a patient man watches a river, as if waiting for the right moment to step in. Outside the saloon door, a pair of ranch hands were already talking about the Whitmore place, measuring its worth in acres and water wells. One of them said the bank would send men out soon to make sure nothing disappeared before the official claim. The other only nodded, because everyone in town understood what that meant. Inside, the stranger listened without turning his head. His gloved hand rested on the table beside an empty cup while the sounds of the town moved around him. Boots on wood, chairs scraping, quiet laughter. After a long moment he stood, stepped out into the pale morning light, and looked down the road leading out toward the wide stretch of land where Clara Whitmore was still fighting to keep what remained of her father's work, and something in his calm expression suggested that the story unfolding in Dry Creek was not quite as settled as the town believed. By late afternoon, the wind shifted across the valley and carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain over the Whitmore pasture, and Clara Whitmore felt the quiet weight of time pressing harder with every passing hour. 72 hours had once sounded like a long stretch of days, but now it moved faster than the shadow of the barn as the sun slid west across the sky. She spent the afternoon repairing a loose section of fence along the southern field, working with the steady patience that ranch life demanded, even when the future of the land stood balanced on uncertain ground. Every board she set back into place felt like a small promise that the ranch was still alive, still standing, still worth fighting for. A pair of hawks circled high above the pasture, their slow wings tracing wide arcs in the bright sky, and for a moment the world felt quiet again. Back in town, the stranger had mounted his horse and ridden out along the same dusty road Clara had traveled thousands of times since childhood. The horse moved at an easy pace, hooves pressing soft prints into the dry earth while the rider studied the landscape the way a careful man studies a map. Fields stretched out on both sides of the road, some thriving, others worn thin by years of drought and poor luck. When he reached the wooden gate that marked the entrance to Whitmore Ranch, he slowed the horse to a stop and rested his gloved hand against the saddle horn. The sign bearing the Whitmore name creaked slightly in the breeze, its paint faded but still clear enough to read. Beyond the gate, the land rolled gently toward the barn and corrals where Clara continued her work, unaware that the stranger had paused there. He watched for a moment without calling out, taking in the quiet order of the ranch, the repaired fence lines, the cattle moving steadily across the pasture, the careful signs of someone who had not given up yet. A lesser ranch might have already begun to fall apart once the bank notice arrived, but this place still carried the look of determination. After a few seconds, Clara finally noticed the rider waiting by the gate. She straightened slowly, brushing dust from her hands, and walked toward him with the calm caution that life on the frontier had taught her well. The two of them faced each other across the wooden rails while the afternoon wind drifted across the pasture. The stranger nodded once in greeting, a simple gesture that carried neither threat nor apology. Clara studied him carefully, noticing the trail dust on his coat, the quiet steadiness in his posture, the kind of calm that usually belonged to men who had seen more of the world than they cared to explain. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the tall grass. The cattle shifted near the watering trough, and the silence stretched just long enough to become meaningful. Finally, Clara rested her hand on the fence rail and said in an even voice that carried the strength of someone who had spent years making decisions alone, "You are a long way from town if all you wanted was coffee." The stranger glanced across the wide pasture before answering, his voice calm and measured like someone who chose words carefully. Sometimes the road leads a man exactly where he needs to be. Clara did not smile, but something in her expression softened slightly as she studied him again, sensing that the arrival of this quiet rider might not be as simple as it first appeared. And somewhere in the back of her mind a small question began to grow about why a man who asked for nothing had come riding straight toward a ranch the entire town believed was already lost. The afternoon sun lowered slowly across the valley, turning the dry grass into long waves of gold, while the wind carried a steady whisper through the fence posts of Whitmore Ranch. Clara Whitmore rested both hands on the wooden rail and studied the rider in front of her with the careful patience of someone who had learned long ago that strangers on the frontier rarely arrived without a reason. The man did not look like the kind who wandered without purpose. His coat carried the red dust of many miles, and the calm stillness in his posture suggested a man who had spent a great deal of time in the saddle. His horse stood quietly beneath him, breathing slow and steady, as if the animal trusted the silence between them. Clara glanced once across the pasture where her cattle moved in the fading light, then back to the stranger. Most riders passing through Dry Creek were quick to introduce themselves, eager to talk about work, trade, or trouble on the road. This one seemed comfortable letting the quiet settle first. The wind tugged gently at the edge of Clara's cream prairie blouse, while a strand of chestnut hair slipped loose and brushed across her cheek. Somewhere beyond the barn a gate creaked softly. Finally she spoke again, her voice even and clear. Travelers usually keep riding once they reach the edge of Dry Creek. There is not much waiting for them out here. The stranger rested his forearm across the saddle horn and glanced across the wide pasture before answering. Sometimes a man is not looking for what is waiting. Sometimes he is looking for what might disappear. Clara narrowed her eyes slightly at that answer, measuring the words the way she measured cattle or rainfall. People in town had already begun speaking as though her ranch was gone. The bank notice nailed to the fence had a way of changing how others saw the future. She had heard it in their voices, in the quiet way conversation stopped when she entered the store, in the careful sympathy that carried more doubt than comfort. But this man did not speak like someone who had come to witness the end of something. He spoke like someone studying the moment before it changed. Clara folded her arms along the top rail of the fence and said calmly, "The bank believes this land belongs to them in less than 3 days. That tends to settle most arguments around here." The stranger nodded once as if he had already expected that answer. "Banks have a way of believing many things," he said quietly. "The question is whether they are always right." Clara let out a slow breath, the faintest hint of a tired smile touching her lips. "That depends on who you ask. Out here the bank writes the numbers and the sheriff reads them out loud." The rider studied the sign hanging from the fence post again. The name Whitmore Ranch faded but proud against the weathered wood. He seemed to weigh something in his mind, something deeper than the simple matter of a debt. After a long moment, he looked back at Clara. "And what do you believe, Miss Whitmore?" Clara lifted her chin slightly, her green-brown eyes steady in the fading sunlight. "I believe land remembers the people who worked it," she said, "and I am not finished working it yet." For a moment neither of them spoke again. The evening wind carried the low sound of cattle across the pasture, and the quiet between them settled into something heavier than simple conversation. Finally the stranger tipped his hat slightly and turned his horse back toward the road, leading into town. As he rode away, Clara watched him disappear along the dusty path, uncertain whether the meeting had meant anything at all. But far down the road, the quiet rider slowed his horse and glanced back once toward the ranch standing alone against the wide horizon. And in that brief look there was the calm certainty of a man who had just decided something important. Evening settled slowly across the valley after the rider disappeared down the road, leaving Whitmore Ranch wrapped in the quiet rhythm of wind and cattle moving through dry grass. Clara Whitmore remained at the gate for a long moment after he was gone, watching the road long after the dust from his horse had faded into the distance. Something about the meeting lingered in her thoughts, though she could not yet name it. People did not usually ride out to a ranch that the entire town believed was already lost. They usually rode the other direction, toward easier ground and safer prospects. Yet that stranger had paused at her gate like a man studying a puzzle rather than a passing curiosity. The wind shifted again across the pasture and carried the scent of sun-baked earth and distant rain clouds gathering somewhere beyond the hills. Clara finally turned back toward the barn where the evening chores still waited. Losing a ranch did not change the work that had to be done before nightfall. Buckets still needed filling, horses still needed brushing, and the cattle still expected fresh water from the trough. The routine steadied her mind the way it always had. Every familiar movement reminded her that the land was real, not just numbers on a bank ledger. Meanwhile in Dry Creek the stranger rode slowly through the quiet street as the sky deepened into shades of amber and blue. Lamps began to glow behind the windows of the saloon and general store, while the smell of supper drifted out across the wooden boardwalks. A few townsfolk glanced at the rider as he passed, though none of them spoke to him. In a small frontier town, strangers were noticed first and questioned later. Sheriff Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair outside the office and watched the rider approach with the calm patience of a man who had spent many years reading the stories written in other men's faces. The horse slowed to an easy walk as it passed the sheriff's porch. "Evening," the sheriff said quietly. The rider tipped his hat in greeting, but did not stop. "Passing through town," he answered. Sheriff Briggs studied the man for another second before speaking again. "Folks passing through usually ask about work or water before the sun goes down." The rider glanced once toward the far end of the street where the road curved back toward the open prairie. "Sometimes a man needs to see the place before he asks questions," he replied. The sheriff nodded slowly as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Out here, land has a way of telling its own story if you listen long enough," Briggs said. The stranger paused only long enough to give a faint nod of agreement before guiding his horse toward the stable beside the saloon. As the rider dismounted and tied the reins to the hitching post, the sheriff watched carefully from across the street. Men who arrived quietly often left louder stories behind them. Across the valley, the last light faded over Whitmore Ranch while Clara closed the barn doors and looked out across the darkening pasture. The land stretched silent and wide beneath the rising stars, holding its secrets the way the frontier always had. And somewhere in the small town beyond those hills, a stranger who had asked very few questions had begun looking at the same problem that everyone else believed was already solved. The night wind moved softly across the valley, carrying the quiet sounds of the prairie through the open fields of Whitmore Ranch, while the last light disappeared behind the western hills. Clara Whitmore finished securing the barn doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, pausing beside the corral fence as the horses shifted calmly inside their enclosure. Nights on the frontier had a way of slowing a person's thoughts, giving the land time to breathe after a long day beneath the sun. Yet tonight the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the valley itself understood the clock that was quietly running down on the Whitmore land. Clara rested her hand along the top rail and looked out across the dark pasture where the cattle had settled into scattered shapes beneath the rising stars. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and then fell quiet again. Normally that sound belonged to an ordinary night. Tonight it felt like a reminder of how wide and uncertain the frontier could be. In Dry Creek the lamps inside the saloon glowed warm against the dark street, while a few late voices drifted through the swinging doors. The stranger who had ridden in earlier that day sat alone near the back wall, with a cup of coffee cooling beside his hand. Most men in the room had already turned their attention back to their own conversations, but every now and then someone glanced his way out of quiet curiosity. It was not the way he dressed or the horse he rode that made him stand out. It was the calm patience in the way he listened. A man who spoke little often heard more than others expected. Sheriff Walter Briggs stepped into the saloon a short while later, brushing dust from his coat as he crossed the room. He paused beside the stranger's table without sitting down. "You found what you were looking for out on that road today?" the sheriff asked quietly. The rider lifted his eyes from the table. "Sometimes a man finds more than he expected," he answered. The sheriff studied him for a moment, the way a rancher studies a storm cloud on the horizon. "That Whitmore place has good soil and steady water when the rain comes," Briggs said. "Shame to see land like that tangled up in bank papers." The rider glanced toward the saloon window where the dark prairie stretched beyond the town lights. "Land does not usually lose its value overnight," he said. The sheriff nodded slowly. "True enough. But banks do not measure value the same way ranchers do." The stranger took a slow breath and leaned back slightly in his chair. "And sometimes banks forget that numbers written on paper do not always tell the whole story." Outside, the wind carried dust along the empty street while the stars brightened over the quiet valley. Back at Whitmore Ranch, Clara had finished her evening work and stood once more beside the fence, looking across the wide land her father had once promised would always belong to those willing to care for it. The night held its silence like a secret waiting to be uncovered. And miles away in the dim light of the saloon, a quiet rider who had asked almost no questions seemed to be listening very carefully to the same story that the land itself was trying to tell. The prairie night deepened slowly over Dry Creek, and long after the last lantern dimmed in the saloon, the quiet rider remained seated at his table, as if time moved differently for him than it did for the rest of the town. The murmur of voices had faded, chairs had been pushed back, and most of the men who spent their evenings there had already stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the faint smell of coffee and dust. Sheriff Walter Briggs lingered by the bar for a moment longer, studying the stranger the same way a careful rancher studies a distant ridge before deciding whether a storm is truly coming. Finally, the sheriff walked over and rested his hand on the back of the empty chair across from the rider. "You have been quiet since you arrived," Briggs said calmly. "Most travelers tell at least one story before the night ends." The rider looked up slowly, his eyes steady beneath the shadow of his hat. "Some stories are better understood after a man listens first," he replied. The sheriff gave a small, thoughtful nod as if he respected that answer. "Out here the land tells a story too," Briggs said. "Sometimes folks just stop hearing it once money gets involved." The rider glanced toward the window again, where the wide prairie stretched beyond the edge of town. The stars had come out clear and sharp above the valley, scattered like silver across a dark sky. "Does the banker listen to the land?" the rider asked quietly. The sheriff let out a soft breath through his nose. "Harold Sutton listens to numbers. And numbers usually win in towns like this." The rider rested both hands on the table for a moment, thoughtful but calm. "Usually," he repeated. The sheriff caught that single word and raised an eyebrow. "You sound like a man who has seen numbers lose before." The rider gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Sometimes numbers forget to read the small lines beneath them." The sheriff studied him more carefully now, as if a small piece of a larger puzzle had just shifted into place. Across the valley, Whitmore Ranch slept beneath the same sky, the barns dark, the pasture quiet except for the low movement of cattle settling into the grass. Clara Whitmore had finished the last of her evening work and stepped out onto the small porch beside the house. The wooden boards creaked softly under her boots as she looked out across the land she had known since childhood. The horizon stretched wide and silent, holding every memory her family had built there, every fence line her father had raised by hand, every season of drought and rain that had shaped the ranch into what it was now. The notice from the bank still hung on the fence near the road, though in the darkness it was only a pale square barely visible in the moonlight. Clara folded her arms lightly against the cool night breeze, her thoughts steady but restless. The entire town believed the future of this ranch had already been written. Yet something about the day had felt different from the moment that quiet stranger had appeared at the gate. Back in Dry Creek, the rider finally stood from his chair and placed a coin on the table before walking toward the door. Sheriff Briggs watched him step outside into the silver glow of the starlit street. The rider paused for a moment beside his horse, looking out toward the dark road that led back across the valley. Somewhere beyond those hills stood the ranch everyone believed was already lost. But the calm look in the stranger's eyes suggested that the story of that land was not nearly as finished as the town believed. Morning arrived slowly over the valley, the pale light of dawn stretching across the wide grasslands long before the town of Dry Creek fully woke. A thin layer of mist hovered low over the Whitmore pasture, turning the distant fences and grazing cattle into quiet shapes moving through silver air. Clara Whitmore had been awake for hours already. Frontier mornings had a way of pulling a rancher out of bed long before the sun touched the horizon, and this morning felt heavier than most. The clock that mattered now was not hanging on a wall. It was written in the notice nailed to the fence beside the road, counting down the final hours before the bank returned to claim what it believed was already its land. Clara stepped out of the barn carrying a metal bucket and paused beside the corral while the horses shifted gently in the early light. The prairie wind moved through the grass in slow waves, whispering across the wide fields the same way it had every morning since her father first built the ranch house. That steady rhythm reminded her why she had never considered walking away, even when the town had already begun talking about the ranch as if it belonged to someone else. She set the bucket down beside the trough and glanced toward the distant road leading into Dry Creek. The pale strip of dirt stretched quiet and empty beneath the rising sun. Back in town, the same morning light crept along the wooden boardwalks and touched the windows of the bank building standing solid in the center of Main Street. Inside, Harold Sutton had already begun his day. The banker sat behind his polished desk with the same calm confidence he carried every time a piece of land finally passed into his hands. Papers rested neatly in front of him, the Whitmore file sitting on top with its official seal and carefully written numbers. To Sutton, the ranch was no longer a question of history or memory. It was a line in a ledger approaching its final signature. Outside the bank, the town stirred slowly to life. Shop doors opened, wagons rolled past, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the saloon once again. Sheriff Walter Briggs stepped onto the street just as the stranger from the night before walked his horse toward the water trough beside the stable. "Morning," the sheriff said quietly. The rider nodded once and filled a tin cup from the trough before offering the horse a drink. Briggs watched him for a moment, then spoke again. "Word travels fast in a town this size. Folks say you rode out to Whitmore Ranch yesterday." The rider wiped a trace of water from the cup and rested his arm against the saddle. "I did." The sheriff tilted his head slightly, curious but calm. "And what did you think of the place?" The rider looked down the long road that disappeared into the wide prairie beyond the last building in town. "Good land," he said simply. The sheriff nodded slowly, as if that answer carried more meaning than most people would hear. Then he leaned lightly against the hitching post and added, "The bank will be riding out tomorrow morning to settle the matter. Most folks expect it to be a quiet ride." The stranger placed the tin cup back beside the trough and looked once more toward the open road leading back across the valley. "Sometimes quiet rides do not stay quiet for long," he said calmly. Sheriff Briggs studied him for another moment, the faintest hint of interest crossing his face. Because every once in a while a man arrived in Dry Creek who did not follow the ending everyone else had already decided. The sun climbed higher above the valley as the day slowly unfolded across the Whitmore Ranch, its light warming the grass and pushing the last of the morning mist away from the low fields near the creek. Clara Whitmore stood beside the corral gate with one hand resting on the weathered wood, watching the cattle drift lazily across the pasture. The land looked peaceful in the morning light, almost as if the quiet hills refused to acknowledge the paper notice still hanging near the road. Ranches had long memories, and this one had survived storms that no banker had ever bothered to count. A distant sound reached her then, the steady rhythm of horse hooves approaching along the dirt trail that wound through the tall grass from the direction of town. Clara lifted her eyes toward the horizon and saw a familiar silhouette moving through the sunlight. The same quiet rider from the day before guided his horse across the pasture with an easy calm that belonged to someone who had spent most of his life in a saddle. When he reached the fence line, he slowed his horse and tipped his hat politely before dismounting. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said in a voice as steady as the wind moving across the prairie. Clara crossed her arms lightly and studied him with the same calm caution she had carried since the first moment he appeared at her gate. "Morning," she replied. "I did not expect to see you again so soon." The rider rested one hand against the saddle and looked out across the wide pasture as if measuring the land with quiet respect. "Good land does not usually leave a man's thoughts very quickly," he said. Clara followed his gaze across the hills and the grazing herd. "My father used to say the same thing," she answered softly. The rider nodded once, as if that detail explained more than she realized. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the tall grass, and somewhere near the barn a horse shifted gently in the shade. Finally Clara turned back toward him with a steady look in her green eyes. "You did not ride all the way out here just to admire the pasture," she said. The rider gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "No," he replied. "I came because tomorrow morning will arrive sooner than most people think." Clara glanced toward the road where the bank notice still hung from the fence post. "The town believes the matter is already settled," she said. "Most towns believe many things that turn out not to be true," the rider answered quietly. Clara studied him again, noticing the calm patience in his expression, the kind that usually belonged to someone who understood how long certain plans required to unfold. "What is it that you are really looking for out here, Mr. Carter?" she asked. Elias Carter rested his gloved hand lightly on the top rail of the fence and looked toward the distant hills beyond the ranch. "Sometimes a man rides a long way just to see whether a piece of land still belongs to the person who cares about it most," he said. Clara felt a small pause settle between them as the words drifted into the quiet morning air. "And what happens if it does?" she asked slowly. Elias Carter turned back toward her with the same steady gaze he had carried since the first day they met. "Then the story is not finished yet," he said, and somewhere beyond the open prairie road leading back to Dry Creek, The wheels of a polished banker's carriage had already begun rolling toward the valley, carrying with it the certainty of a man who believed numbers always had the final word. The afternoon sun stretched long golden light across the Whitmore Valley, turning the grasslands into waves of bronze that moved slowly beneath the wind. Clara Whitmore stood near the front gate where the dirt road curved toward the distant hills, her hand resting lightly against the wooden fence as she watched the horizon. The ranch carried the quiet patience of land that had seen many seasons, yet today the silence felt different, as if the valley itself understood that something important was approaching. Elias Carter stood a few steps behind her. Beside the hitching rail, his tall frame still and steady, his gray-blue eyes following the same distant road. For most of the morning the world had seemed calm enough to forget about the notice nailed to the fence, but time had a way of moving forward whether a person welcomed it or not. Clara broke the silence first. "They will come today," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Harold Sutton does not appear to be the sort of man who waits longer than necessary." Clara gave a faint breath that carried both determination and quiet acceptance. "The town believes this place is already gone," she said. "They have been talking about it for weeks." Elias rested his gloved hand along the top rail of the fence and studied the wide stretch of pasture where cattle moved slowly beneath the afternoon sky. "Towns often decide the ending of a story before they have read the last page," he replied. Clara glanced toward him with a thoughtful look. "And you believe there is still another page left?" Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached inside his worn coat and removed a folded envelope, the paper aged but carefully preserved. He turned it in his hand for a moment before holding it toward her. Clara accepted it slowly, curiosity touching her expression as she opened the fold. Inside was a document written many years earlier, its ink faded but still clear enough to read beneath the sunlight. Her eyes moved across the page once, then again more slowly. "This is my father's name," she said under her breath. Elias nodded. "I spent some time in the county records office this morning before sunrise. Old papers sometimes remain forgotten until someone decides they are worth looking for." Clara read the lines again, her brow tightening with quiet concentration. It described a boundary agreement written decades earlier between her father and a neighboring rancher whose land stretched along the creek that ran through the valley. According to the document, a portion of the grazing land Sutton believed belonged to the bank had never actually been included in the original loan contract. Clara looked up at Elias, surprise mixing with cautious hope. "If this is recognized," she said slowly, "the bank's claim does not cover half the pasture." Elias gave a calm nod. "And without that pasture the numbers on Sutton's ledger look very different." Clara folded the paper carefully, holding it as if it carried more weight than its thin pages suggested. Down the road the distant shape of a carriage finally appeared beyond the low ridge leading into the valley. Sunlight flashed across polished wheels as the vehicle rolled closer, carrying the confidence of a banker who believed the land ahead already belonged to him. Clara watched the approaching carriage for a long moment, then turned back toward Elias Carter. The wind moved through the prairie grass again, quiet and steady. For the first time since the notice had appeared on her fence, the ending of the story no longer seemed quite as certain as the town had believed. The banker's carriage rolled slowly down the dirt road toward Whitmore Ranch, its polished wheels catching the late afternoon sunlight, as if the vehicle itself carried the quiet certainty of a decision already made. Harold Sutton sat upright inside, gloved hands resting neatly on the head of his cane, while the driver guided the horses along the familiar trail. To Sutton, the valley ahead was already part of his ledger, another piece of land that numbers had patiently delivered into his possession. As the carriage crested the final low hill, the ranch spread out before him in a wide sweep of pasture and fences, the barn standing weathered but strong against the prairie wind. Near the front gate, two figures waited beside the wooden fence, still and calm beneath the open sky. Clara Whitmore stood with the folded document held carefully in her hand while Elias Carter rested one arm along the top rail beside her, his tall frame quiet against the horizon. The carriage slowed and finally stopped near the gate, the horses shifting gently as the driver pulled the reins. Harold Sutton stepped down from the carriage with the composed confidence of a man accustomed to having the final word in matters like this. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said with polite formality as he removed his hat. I trust the day has given you enough time to prepare for the inevitable arrangements. Clara held his gaze steadily. Good afternoon, Mr. Sutton, she replied calmly. The land looks the same as it did yesterday. Sutton allowed himself a small measured smile. Land often looks the same, even when its ownership changes. That is the nature of progress. His eyes shifted briefly toward Elias Carter. And I see your visitor has returned. Elias tipped his hat once in greeting, but said nothing. Sutton turned back toward Clara and opened the leather folder he carried beneath his arm, revealing several official papers already prepared with precise signatures waiting at the bottom. As of this afternoon, he continued smoothly, the bank is prepared to finalize the transfer of Whitmore Ranch according to the agreement signed 3 years ago. Clara listened without interrupting, the wind stirring lightly through the pasture behind her. When Sutton finished speaking, she unfolded the document Elias had given her earlier and held it out for him to see. Before anything is finalized, you may wish to look at this, she said. Sutton accepted the paper with the faint patience of a man expecting a minor delay rather than a true obstacle. His eyes moved across the page once, then again more slowly. The calm certainty in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he read the faded lines describing the original boundary agreement recorded decades earlier in the county archives. Sutton lifted his eyes toward Clara with a more careful look now. This document is quite old, he said. Clara nodded. Old enough that most people forgot it was still there. Elias Carter finally spoke then, his voice quiet but steady. County records tend to keep their memory longer than towns do. Sutton glanced toward him, studying the stranger more closely for the first time. And you are the gentleman who discovered this forgotten memory, I presume. Elias met his gaze evenly. I simply spent some time reading. The banker looked down at the document again while the wind moved softly across the wide prairie. Because if the boundary described in those faded lines proved to be correct, the land Sutton believed already belonged to his bank might not belong to him nearly as completely as he had believed when he began the ride out to the valley that afternoon. The wind moved gently across Whitmore Valley as the afternoon sun lowered toward the western hills, casting long, quiet shadows across the pasture. Harold Sutton stood beside the ranch gate with the faded document still held in his hand, reading the lines again with the careful attention of a man who had spent most of his life trusting numbers more than old stories. The silence stretched between the three figures standing by the fence while the prairie grass whispered softly around them. Clara Whitmore watched the banker's expression without speaking, her calm patience revealing nothing except the quiet strength that had kept her standing on this land long after the town believed she would lose it. Elias Carter remained beside the fence rail, one gloved hand resting lightly on the weathered wood, his gray-blue eyes steady as the horizon behind him. Sutton finally lowered the document and looked toward the distant pasture where the creek curved through the land like a silver ribbon beneath the fading sun. According to this agreement, he said slowly, the eastern grazing fields were never included in the original loan boundary. Clara nodded once. My father made that arrangement with our neighbor before the loan was ever written. Sutton studied the wide stretch of pasture again, calculating quietly in the careful way bankers measured every acre. The value of the remaining property without those grazing fields would be significantly different, he admitted. Elias spoke calmly beside him. Numbers can change when the land beneath them shifts. Sutton glanced toward the quiet rider, studying him with sharper interest now. You rode into town 2 days ago, he said. Yet somehow you located a document buried in county archives older than most of the buildings in Dry Creek. Elias Carter gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Sometimes a man has reason to look carefully at the past before deciding what the future should look like. Sutton folded the paper slowly, his earlier certainty replaced by the quiet calculations now forming in his mind. Without the eastern pasture included in the bank's claim, the value of Whitmore Ranch no longer covered the full amount of the original loan, which meant the bank did not hold full authority over the property as he had believed when he began the ride to the valley that afternoon. Clara spoke gently into the long pause that followed. My father always said land has its own memory. Sutton looked out across the ranch once more, the barns standing steady against the prairie sky, while cattle moved slowly through the tall grass. The place carried a quiet dignity that even a banker could recognize when he stood close enough to see it. Finally Sutton slipped the document back toward Clara. It appears the matter will require further review in the county office, he said carefully. The final decision cannot be made today. Clara accepted the paper, her fingers closing around it with calm relief rather than triumph. Elias Carter remained silent beside the fence while the wind brushed softly through the prairie once more. Harold Sutton stepped back toward his carriage, thoughtful now rather than certain. Because the quiet land stretching across Whitmore Valley had just reminded a man who believed in numbers that sometimes the oldest lines written on paper could still change the ending of a story. The banker's carriage rolled slowly away from Whitmore Ranch as the sun settled lower behind the distant hills, its fading light spreading warm amber across the wide valley. Dust lifted gently behind the wheels before settling again along the quiet road that led back toward Dry Creek. Harold Sutton sat inside the carriage in thoughtful silence, the confidence he carried earlier replaced by the quiet calculations of a man who had just discovered that the land he believed he owned still belonged to someone who understood it better than numbers ever could. Behind him, the valley returned to its natural stillness, the ranch standing exactly where it had stood for decades, unchanged by papers or signatures or the expectations of a town that had already written its ending too soon. Clara Whitmore remained beside the wooden gate watching the carriage disappear over the ridge, the folded document still resting securely in her hand. The evening breeze moved softly through the tall prairie grass, carrying the steady sound of cattle shifting across the pasture and the distant creak of the barn doors settling in the wind. For the first time in many weeks, the weight she had carried across her shoulders felt lighter, as if the land itself had quietly taken part of the burden back. She finally turned toward Elias Carter, who still stood beside the fence rail, his tall frame calm beneath the wide open sky. For a moment, she simply studied him, the same quiet curiosity returning that had followed him since the morning he first rode through the ranch gate. Most men would not ride across half the territory just to read old records in a county office, she said gently. Elias glanced across the pasture where the evening light stretched long shadows beneath the grazing cattle. Sometimes a man rides because a place reminds him of something he once knew, he replied. Clara tilted her head slightly. Something you once knew, or someone? Elias rested both hands on the fence rail, the silver horseshoe pendant at his neck catching the last thread of sunlight. My father passed through this valley many years ago, he said slowly. He worked here one season when your father was building the north fence line. Clara looked at him with quiet surprise. My father hired many hands in those years, she said. Elias nodded once. Mine spoke about this ranch long after he left. Said the man who owned it believed land should stay with the people who cared enough to stand beside it when times turned difficult. Clara let out a small breath of recognition. That sounds exactly like him. The wind moved through the grass again, carrying the low, peaceful sound of the herd settling for the night. Elias looked out across the valley one last time before stepping toward his horse. The saddle creaked softly as he gathered the reins. Clara watched him with the faintest hint of a smile. Are you planning to disappear as quietly as you arrived, Mr. Carter? Elias paused beside the stirrup and met her eyes beneath the fading gold sky. I was only making sure the story reached the right ending, he said calmly. Clara glanced across the ranch that now stood safe beneath the evening horizon. Then she looked back at him. Perhaps stories like this still have another chapter, she said. Elias considered that for a moment before mounting his horse. Out here, he replied quietly, the land usually decides that part. The prairie wind carried his words into the wide valley as he rode slowly down the long dirt road, leaving Whitmore Ranch behind exactly where it belonged, beneath the open sky and in the hands of the woman who had refused to walk away from it.